The aim of this video is to provide you with a background to abstract reasoning tests and teach you the methodology of how to successfully answer these in order to help you perform better at completing these tests. There are numerous test providers in the world that provide abstract reasoning tests. Sometimes test providers may also call it by another name, such as inductive reasoning tests, diagrammatic reasoning tests, or logical reasoning tests. Essentially, all of these tests are the same, they just have a different naming convention. So, what are these tests actually measuring? Abstract reasoning tests measure your ability to reason with information presented in an abstract format. It measures your lateral thinking skills or fluid intelligence, which is your ability to quickly identify patterns, logical rules, and trends in new data, and then integrate this information and apply it to solve problems. Essentially, it is measuring your ability or aptitude to reason logically. Generally, abstract reasoning tests measure your logical reasoning through nonverbal methods. Usually, these tests require you to use logical and abstract reasoning to extract rules, analogies, and structures, which you use to find a correct answer among a set of possible options. Each question in an abstract reasoning test requires you to figure out what rule you must apply to get the correct answer, and then apply this rule accurately to identify the correct answer. The trick to doing well in these tests is to understand the rule required to solve the problem. So, in order to perform really well in abstract reasoning tests, the first thing you need to do is understand and know the rules to expect when completing these tests. The first rule is called rotations or angles. And this rule, you can expect diagrams to be rotated to a certain degree or angle. So for example, a diagram might be rotated 90 degrees or even clockwise, or maybe another way, multiple times in order to form a sequence or pattern. The second rule is called axial reflections. In questions that have axial reflections, the diagram will flip horizontally or vertically in a pattern. The next rule is called inversions. In inversion questions, the shades of the entire diagram or picture will invert. So, for example, a square might go from being completely black to completely white in a pattern. The fourth type of rule is called translations. In these type of questions, an object is moved in the sequence. You will then need to use logic to identify the pattern behind how the object is being moved in the sequence. The fifth rule is called visual arithmetic. Visual elements in a pattern are given a number element in the instructions. You are then required to identify the number elements and use arithmetic to find the next diagram in the sequence. The sixth rule is called transformations. In these type of questions, a pattern is created using a marked change. The marked change can be in form or appearance of an object. The seventh rule is called superposition or composition. In these questions, a visual element is comprised of more than just one object. So, you can't always see what makes up the whole visual element, but it can be identified by analyzing the whole sequence. For example, in a sequence, a triangle might be representing a triangle and a cross. And if you look at the next image in the pattern, the cross will appear once the triangle moves over. The eighth rule is called indicators. In these type of questions, an object is used to represent various visual elements in a diagram. So you'll need to follow the instructions and unpack, for example, what a triangle is representing. The ninth rule is additions or subtractions. So in these types of questions, visual elements or objects are either added and or subtracted to create a pattern. The next rule is called sequences. With these type of questions, you will be provided with instructions of a sequence. Then you'll need to carry on how the pattern works. The last rule is something called flushing objects. These questions provide you with instructions on how objects or shadings of objects repeat throughout a sequence. Now, I know I've run through these rules quite quickly, but if you watch the following videos, these rules will be discussed more in depth in separate videos with proper examples. So, the following is just some more information on rules that you might find insightful. Every rule can have a different frequency. Some rules may be single and continuous, while other rules may be exponential or even reverse. So, for example, a sequence may have one object repeated in every diagram, whereas in other questions, an object may grow exponentially in size. Every abstract reasoning test from a different test publisher is different. However, you can expect between 2 or 4 patterns or rules to identify in each question. Once you have identified the rule, you will need to follow the rule's logic to identify the correct answer. And lastly, the difficulty of abstract reasoning tests depends on the number of rules you will need to identify, as well as the complexity of each rule. For example, some rules may be more simple, such as identifying a simple repeating pattern, while other rules may be more complex and require you to identify an irregular pattern. We are now going to go through some things that you can expect from an abstract reasoning test. Abstract reasoning test usually consists of 10 to 20 questions. The time you are allowed for each test varies. However, you can expect approximately 1 minute to answer each question. Each question in our abstract reasoning test contains 5 frames and 5 answer alternatives that you will have to choose one answer from to follow the pattern or sequence. You are usually awarded 1 mark or point for each question answered correctly, and 0 points for questions answered incorrectly. Please note that there is also only 1 correct answer per question. There is also no negative marking in most abstract reasoning tests, so it is advisable that you still guess the correct answer. The pass mark for abstract reasoning tests is usually 50%. However, every company can decide on their own benchmark for these tests. Please bear in mind that you should always strive to score higher than the pass mark, as a company may still select another person if they outperform you. So you will need to make sure that you can score as high as possible on your test. Usually only black and white colors or shading of different grays are used to illustrate the patterns. However, other colors can be used too, but this is very rare. Abstract reasoning tests only make use of 2-dimensional shapes, so there is no need to worry about receiving a pattern with 3-dimensional shapes and trying to figure out the logic behind that. You are usually fully provided for, so this means that you will require no other tools, and everything that you will need to answer the questions you will have in front of you when completing the test. You will also most likely not be allowed to take anything into the examination room, so be prepared to only take yourself in. The best way to approach an abstract reasoning test is to use a systematic approach. To do this, you should first start with identifying the building blocks. By this, we mean you need to look at the building blocks in the question that you have at hand. This will make it easier for you to concentrate on the building blocks one by one and the relationships between them without missing anything. And this will also be crucial in the next stage. For example, if you look at this pattern, the building blocks are a triangle and a hexagon. It is also good to note what colors are prevalent. In this example, all shapes are black, which means the answer must only have black shapes. Once you have identified the building blocks, you need to start thinking what is happening to these building blocks. We call this rule finding. An abstract reasoning question may have multiple rules, so start by trying to find the first rule. Some obvious things to look out for could be a common denominator. This refers to something that each pattern in the sequence has, or it could be how an object moves left or right. Another thing to look out for is the relationship between the sizes of the objects. Once you have identified the rules, you should start eliminating the incorrect answers. This should hopefully leave you with the option that is the correct answer. Always remember to test the logic behind the rule when you think you have identified the correct answer. So now that we know a little bit more about abstract reasoning tests, the great thing is that you can actually improve your test score. Your abstract reasoning score is not static in nature. This means that you can improve your abstract reasoning capabilities, and you can do it in a reasonably short time. So you may be wondering, how do you improve your test score? It has to do with efficiently learning the typical logical rules so that when you're faced with an abstract reasoning test question, you will be able to quickly identify the relevant rule or rules for this series of shapes. If you watch the videos that follow this introduction video, you'll get a better understanding of what rules there are. So all it takes is practice, practice, and practice. So we were speaking about improving your test score, but some other tips and tricks include understanding some test-taking strategies. Before you begin your abstract reasoning test, take the time to properly read the test instructions. In these test instructions, it should tell you how much time you have to complete the assessment and how many questions you will need to answer. If you have this information, take the time to work out how long you have to answer each question. As much as possible, try to answer all the questions. Usually you are given easier questions first, and then as you go through them, they will become progressively harder. So try to answer all the questions as you go through them, as the questions are just going to become more and more difficult. If you cannot answer a question, it is possible to mark questions so that if you have time, you can return to them and give them another try. Sometimes returning fresh to a question is also beneficial. Keep it simple. If you are stuck on a question, then consider that you might be overcomplicating things as well. Some questions look complicated, but are not really complicated. So try your best to look at these questions in the most simplest form. If you are really struggling with a question, you can start by eliminating the incorrect answers. You will then be left with some more reasonable answers that you can take a guess from. Remember, there is no negative marking, so rather take an educated guess than leave it unanswered. Also, every question answered correctly is allocated the same mark, so there is no pressure to answer the more difficult questions instead of easier questions. Also, look out for trick questions. Some questions may seem so easy. If this is the case, it might be a trick question. A last resort is to see what answer alternatives have in common. This can sometimes point you in the right direction. To make the answer options as difficult as possible, one has to make them similar. This should only be used as a last resort and is not recommended unless you have absolutely no clue what the answer should be. For example, in this image, you can see how each answer has two circles in the same place. I want to give you some last helpful hints and tips to perform better at these tests. Keep track of your time when completing abstract reasoning tests. Remember, these tests are timed, so you can't take as long as you want to answer each question. You need to use a strategy to quickly find the correct answer. Learn to gauge when you have spent too long answering a question. If you are spending too much time on one question, it is best to move on to the next question. Before completing your test, you should also gauge how much time you will need to answer each question within in order to complete the test on time. This way, you will know when you have spent too long on one question and must swiftly move along. Where possible, you should also try to win time on easier questions. This will allow you to spend more time on the harder questions. If a question is too easy, consider that it could be a trick question. Again, like I said before in this video, questions that are too easy, you should reconsider as there is likely to be some trick behind it. And practice, practice, practice. Remember, your abstract reasoning is not static. Therefore, you can improve your performance on your test score by practicing.